Eduardo, you've been around the Vue ecosystem for like 4 or 5 years now.
Yeah.
How did you choose to go with Vue, especially 5 years ago?
React wasn't that popular back then, and AngularJS was the thing that everybody was using. So we were hitting problems with AngularJS, performance problems, maintenance, like technical debt problems, because it wasn't that easy to organize your code and the logic, UI logic and the business logic together. And all that together was sometimes quite frustrating as a developer to work with. So in the evenings, I would do my own personal projects in web, and I was looking for libraries out there that existed and that were not AngularJS to try out things. And I saw React, didn't like that. I didn't feel like it was helping me to create what I wanted and to put my ideas out in code. I also found other things like Mithril, Polymer at that time, and I found Vue. And so the Vue, the homepage with the Hello World example really hit to me. And then as I was using it more and more, every time I wanted to do something, I felt like there was a way to do things, and I will search it on the documentation. I will find it was exactly the way I had in mind. So I felt very compelled by that. So I kept working on that with personal projects, pushed a little bit at work as well for some client projects, and we use it in I think 1 or 2 projects, and it was great. And then I moved on. At that time, I was already out in the core team after that, and I've been using it since then.
Well, how did you get into the core team?
So I'm the creator of Vue.js. Wanted more help to maintain the thing because he was noticing that there was some attention into the framework, and so not only Vue but also the other libraries. And there are people who were active in the community, helping issues, commit and pull requests and stuff. So he asked on Twitter who wanted to join, if he wanted to create a core team, and who wanted to join. So I applied, so say, and then I found myself a few days later on a Slack channel with other people.
That's awesome. You know, the thing that you're in charge of is Vue Router.
Yeah.
And it's probably the single most important piece outside the core framework. How did you come about just building the router? Did you have any background in building routers or architecture?
No, I think architecture in general, yes. The architecture of the router I just came up with some practice. But like every other open source maintainer that you find around in projects, I think, and any other developer on any work, at the end you learn a lot on the spot. So I did my research when I wanted to learn topics. I've seen problems come up from people in issues, so I have to do the research based on that, and see how to solve the problem, where does the problem comes from, what are the different solutions. So I didn't have any background on the router and URL encoding and how the browsers, like URLs in general. And the last version of the new one, the version 4, I actually wrote it over the span of a year. So it started the work 2 years ago and 1.5 years ago, I think. Wait, I can look the commit, but you can even look at it. It's public. But I've been through a lot of changes, like reorganizing, decoupling things, and it helped me to build something that I think is quite robust and quite decoupled. Like the different part of the router have their own responsibilities, and it's easier, I think, to fix bugs and introduce new features.
But I guess most people would think that the major changes in the next generation router would be compliance with Vue 3 and composition API, use route, use router.
Actually, it's the opposite. It tries to stay as close as possible as the existing Vue router. Like, there are very little break-in changes. It's very specific things and improvement that have been done, but the main APIs are all there. Like, all of them are there. Before, all the guards, I didn't simplify any of them, which is something that probably is going to happen at some point because they are quite redundant now. I did introduce new patterns, and also those new patterns probably allow me to remove some of the things that exist. Like the meta property can now be changed during navigation, giving you some kind of during navigation state that you can hold during that navigation, but then it's dropped as soon as you navigate somewhere else. And then if you reload the page or anything is lost, you can use that. Inside the router, there are a lot of changes. The architecture is completely different. There is no more path to regex to transform the paths that you give to the router into regex. I have a custom version I did myself that allows me to also score the routes, so I can order them to have dynamic routing working as well, because the router has to match them in order, and it has to know which one it's more likely to be harder to match, so to say. So it's going to try that first, which one is more specific. And then the encoding has been redone as well. I tried to remove all the caveats. Like there were situations that were not consistent in the old router, and removing them will be a breaking change. There are some breaking changes that I wanted to bring, so now is the time to bring those breaking changes. Also, like the navigation failures being resolved promises instead of rejected promises, so people don't see uncaught promise rejection in many places. And all the things that, and there are a few things that also can be backport. For example, the route prop on router view that allows you to control what actual route is rendered. So you can do modal with that. Or basically you can display a different URL. You don't have to connect the actual display of the router view to the URL if you use a route prop on V4, on Vue Router. And also the other big change that can be backported is allowing the navigation guards not to have a next callback and to instead return the value that you passed to next, which was very funny because it was like a 2-line change to add that feature, or 3 lines. It was really small.
What problems do you think that is going to solve?
The not calling next.
Yeah.
So people very often fall in one of these scenarios. They call next too many times. I mean, too many times more than once, or they don't call next. But when you have a return, you can only return once.
That's smart.
Which is exactly what you have on next. And if you don't call it, you still have a return of undefined by default in JavaScript. So it's still as if you were returning undefined. So it's still as if you called next with nothing. So people can no longer forget to call it, and they can no longer call it multiple times. So it removes those 2 caveats. So another person who is very active in the Vue community, he told me, why don't we remove the last argument? And I was like, well, that wouldn't work, because I thought about it and I saw some problems. And I think I oversee some things, because very often I look at a problem and I see, I cannot solve this yet. So I put it aside, and then I come back and I find other ways of solving it too. Or with new feedback, I realize that the problems that I had in mind are no longer a concern. So I can still, I can reapproach the problem. And he said, what if the argument is optional? And Evan another day told me the same. What about dropping the next callback? You can check the length of the function arguments to make it backward compatible on top of that. So not only it's an opt-in, but it's also backward compatible. So if you pass the next argument, you can use it. If you don't, you have to return. And then I try it out and it works. And I was like, oh, well, let's just keep it then.
When you think about all the features for the Vue Router, do you ever take a look at other routers like React Router?
Yeah, I do. Even more now, and I think it's healthy. And I think probably Evan also. I think he also does that for like Svelte, React, and Angular to see what they are doing, what they're coming up with. And I think it's a good idea to see what others are doing, because sometimes people think about a way of doing things that you didn't think about it, and then you come up with something. So it's great that even though we don't always communicate between us, like We don't talk about, oh, how do you implement these? Or, oh, I would do the router cars, I would do it that way. And this other person say, oh, I would rather do it that way. And you both do it, and then you get feedback from each other. We don't communicate, but I think we still read each other's code because it's open source. So I have read Reach Router code, React Router a little bit, history implementation as well. And I see things I disagree with because there is still opinions in the code, so I implement things differently. Sometimes I implement something, and after that, I go check other people's code to get more fun out of it, because if you check the code first, then you're gonna be biased by the version you read. So if I want to come up with something different, I try to go from the API that I want to export to the user, and then build from that and try to make it work. And then after that, once I'm done, once I refactored, I can go check all the code. So lately, like after releasing the betas and stuff, after the code being quite stable, the code base itself, that's when I started looking at other routers, like pretty much any other library around.
One of the libraries that you created is the Promise library, Vue Promise.
Yeah, it was more about the concept, I think, that was interesting more than the library.
Okay, can you speak to that?
So when you use something like Vue Promise, you are likely handling the loading client side, and if you're doing server-side rendering, you want to await the promise on the server and make sure that you can serialize the information that the promise result, you serialize that to the client, and the client picks up instead of fetching the promise again. Now, use promise is still very naive. Vue Promise is very naive in that aspect because it doesn't really handle that. It's more about client-side fetching and handling the loading. If you look at other solutions like Fetch on Next, for example, that's more interesting because they do fetch the request on the server once, but then when you go on the client and you have the iteration of the page, there is no second request. However, if you go from another page, there is a request, and you can also get the loading state and everything.
I was going to talk about favorite features of Vue 3, and now I realize that, hey, it's not just one. I have several. Suspense and the whole asynchronous nature is definitely one of my favorite. And I can span all the way to TypeScript support. I really love.
For me, it's just the composition API just makes things so much easier for a library author. It's so much easier to extract some behavior and just share it. So that's the thing by far.
I personally feel very strongly about developers' ability to properly optimize the bundle, code splitting and so on, not just by the routing level, but actually be very smart and look for things like above default content and critical path and what needs to be prioritized and what not. And now Suspense really nailed it. And I feel, it does carry the same name from React, but I feel like the Vue team went much further with that support.
It's hard to say for me because since it's an experimental feature, I've only used it in experiments. I haven't used it in production-ready code or anything. And I didn't play with React Suspense much, so to say. Because the only features, what are the features that I wanted to use that are inside Suspense? Maybe I think even the async components do not need Suspense, right? Like the only things you need is a sync setup. That's the only thing that support that brings Suspense. And I'm not doing that much.
Okay.
Because I handle most of them inside of the routing very often.
Okay.
Like before navigating to the route, and then I handle that inside of the route when you are refreshing params and query things. But I think, and I'm more excited about integrating with Next and helping the team also to, I'm already helping them with integrating that with Router View, because it's a bit complicated. It's not a bit complicated, but let's say that you have patterns that you may want to have with the Suspense and the fallback content, that you cannot always have, and also the way that Suspense works and the way the router works makes some things incompatible. For example, if you wanna execute some hooks, some guard hooks, you have to mount the component. So for the hook to trigger, if you have to mount the component, then unless you do some stuff around Vue, the router view, it means that you have to finish the navigation before triggering the hook, which is not possible because you finished the navigation already. Imagine you want to have a before enter route and you want to execute that on the setup, inside the setup.
Is that going to change the router, or is that going to be a very clever implementation on the next side?
No, that's not possible right now. Just because it's not. Because if you want to you want to execute some code in setup that's gonna block the navigation, well, you need to still render the component to read that information in the setup. But if you read the information from the setup, it means that you mounted the component. And if you mounted the component, it means that we navigated to the route that renders that component, which means that the navigation is finished. There is no more waiting for any navigation hook. So you cannot add a navigation hook. You cannot wait. You cannot do a before enter, for example. It's not the easiest one to explain without only with words, to be honest. But basically, you try to do something after it's finished. So it's too late to modify it. And that's one thing that doesn't work with Suspense and the router. And it would require to change how the router view works, or create a new router view that can somehow mount the page we're navigating to before even finishing. So we can read anything that is done inside setup to still control the navigation and still modify how the navigation is going to happen and abort it. But right now, the router view, the way it works is it displays the current location. So the current route, if you do use route, or if you do router.current route, current location, you have a route object, a normalized route object with path, the params, the query, the hash, and you have a match array. And the match array is all the components that the router view has to render.
Well, you started working with Vue right after your exposure to AngularJS. I imagine some of the things were familiar coming from AngularJS, I guess, templating and stuff like this. Right. And I guess now there are a lot of things that are similar to React as well. So it's it's very easy for someone coming from the React background to move and start working on Vue.
To me, they are still quite different. I think the composition API, being similar to the hooks API, does bring that barrier down for people to switch from one to the other. But because of how, I think, for example, when it comes to CSS solutions, they are so different because Vue is very template oriented. You can do JSX, but most people don't. And React is the opposite. You only do JSX. So of course, the solution you have to come up with CSS to integrate it with JSX is not the same as you will do if you only have HTML which is, well, I would just do the usual CSS, right? Which is what happens in Vue. But you can still find the style components and CSS module and stuff. So I think they're quite far away when it comes to, you still have a barrier, like there are still quite a few things to learn. Maybe less now, but I'm curious about your experience though. But
well, definitely less. One thing, I don't want to make this a CSS and JS kind of a discussion. I'm very strongly opinionated about CSS, and I'm going to say that I enjoy working with CSS and Vue in a single file components, and there goes it. I think CSS is made has a specific purpose. It gets fed into the layout renderer, and I don't see why it wouldn't follow the rules of the CSS because it's the standard, right?
Yeah.
And the way Vue single file components work with the loader in the background that separates CSS from JavaScript templates into the meaningful parts, I think that totally makes sense. Yeah. Sometimes I wonder, this is, And sometimes I wonder if having a single file component is truly a great thing. But really that depends on the developer, mostly because I like to see things side by side over scrolling. And I still try to maintain small files, not more than 200 lines of code and all that stuff.
For sure.
Yeah, I love working with Vue. I love working with React as well. I'm not gonna lie. I love both frameworks. And now, people ask me a lot, what do you suggest? What should we go with? Should we go with React or should we go with Vue?
What we always say in the team is I don't want to persuade people. I think that they both work differently for different people. So I think that you should try it on yourself to build small projects and read any course, any documentation for Vue. The official documentation for Vue is nice. Maybe on React, I think the documentation is getting much better now and it's great, but I haven't read it, so I cannot say. But you can also find courses online. So just try building something with both and see what will you prefer, to be honest. And that's what we always say. Take one day to build one thing with one and take another day to build one thing with the other, and you will see. And I don't think there is a really one that is better than the other. It's just that one prefer using one than the other.
Yeah. Well, people are going to go into depths like which one is faster, or which one is smaller.
And I find myself in that trap. I'm trying to optimize my library few bytes, just it, which is not. It's not going to change anything. Like, sure, if you are building an application that is maybe 5 kilobytes because you're targeting some specific scenarios, then you will probably want to use very specific library. But if not, library that an application that is 100 kilobyte and an application that is 200 kilobytes is not going to change that much. The libraries are not going to change that size. It's your code that makes that bigger.
No,
so having one library that makes 20 or one library that makes 30, that's not going to change the end of your code at the end.
You see, that's why I really like the asynchronous nature of Vue and Suspense and stuff, because I just happen to see a lot of code bases, a lot of assessments and so on. What I usually see is not 100 or 200 kilobyte application.
No,
I see bundles or chunks like the core being 800 or a megabyte.
Yeah, and also because I didn't say, but there is not only the final size of the bundle, but how you split it up, and there are so many other things that you can do to optimize the performance. The performance is not just the size of the bundle. What does change, though, is sometimes the way you write the code can compress better than other ways. But I still think that the impact is... It's still... if you write everything that way, for example, using the composition API, things compress better, because you have functions with names and the names are minified afterwards, instead of having properties in objects which have to maintain the same key name, so you maintain the same names everywhere.
Yeah, they don't manifest.
So the other way is minifies better and compress better, because you reuse the same name variables across different scopes, so at the end you probably repeat the same maybe patterns that are also longer in some places, and you can compress better. Depends. It may kind of compress better in some cases, not in otherwise, but it does minify better. That's for sure.
Yeah. Well,
so at the end, if you write everything like that, compression is a bit more complicated.
Yeah, it depends on duplication of the same things.
Duplication is the main.
Yeah.
The main thing that changes.
And variables get mangled, right? And
exactly, with the composition API.
Yeah.
So that's something.
Hey, it's been really great having this conversation with you. I'm glad that you're such a great guy. I always had fun talking to you, hanging out with you at all these events, and I'm glad people got a chance to see that you're a real person, that you're not someone who just replies to issues and whatnot.
Issues, yeah.
And if you're around Vue Router or any other libraries in the Vue ecosystem or any open source ecosystem, these are the people who make things happen, and there's a lot we can learn from you guys. Thank you so much for making our lives easier.
Yeah, thank you for Well, thank you for the support as well. It's what also keeps us going, I guess. It's one of the things that keeps us going.
Libraries like Vue and Vue Router do deserve to be supported. Some people, people are taking time out of their lives. They could have been doing something else, but they're helping us. So it deserves, merits some support. Talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon.
Have a great one.
Goodbye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.